Steve was going from memory there, and he got my background a little bit confused, so let me straighten it out. I did study economics under Milton Friedman at the University of Chicago, and I got my PhD there. Then I became an assistant professor at Harvard, and while I was at Harvard, I went on leave for a year to serve as a senior staff economist at the President's Council of Economic Advisors. And over the course of my career, I have published about 100 professional articles, but only one of them deals with money. 40 years ago, I collaborated with James Buchanan, who you heard about, Nobel Prize winner, on a paper titled Gold, Money, and the Law. But I think that's the only paper on my curriculum vitae that deals with money. Nevertheless, I have a long-standing interest in money. When I was about 15 years old, my father introduced me to the ideas of Robert Defemery, whose book, Rights versus Privileges, you can find at the back of the room. So I was an advocate of 100% reserve banking before I really understood it very well. So anyway, that's the background from which I come to the subject. Now, in some other preliminary remarks, I want to say that, as Steve said, I have been to all these conferences. And I think that this one has a different tone than the others. I think that because we've been amongst each other for all these many years, we've really raised the level of discourse among ourselves. We have a much higher level of understanding of the things we're talking about. Furthermore, I'd say that my slides aren't necessarily that interesting, but I've seen some really wonderful slides this time. I would like to have a copy of everybody's slides because they're just so fantastic. Yeah. So with that, I'll get on to the subject of today. Now let's see. So I'm talking about monetary reform, banking reform, and land reform. What do these things have in common? What I see they have in common is that if you control them, you can get resources for yourself without doing anything. They're sources of unearned income. If you have land, you can be the owner of the land and collect rent without doing anything. If you have money, if you have power over money, you can print money and spend it, collect stuff without doing anything. If you have banking under your control, you can create money by making loans and collect the interest. All ways of getting stuff without doing anything. And I would say that all these things only work because you have an element of monopoly power. If we didn't have a system where only one person has the land, if land were a free-for-all and anybody could use the land at any time, it wouldn't be worth anything. So you need somebody to be in charge of the land. Whoever has the land gets the rent. If anybody who wanted to could print money, we'd have huge inflation and money wouldn't be worth anything. You need some monopoly control over the money supply for that to work. And banking is a little bit different. If you had a completely if you had a perfect competition in the banking system, banking wouldn't make any more profit than any other application of effort. It's only because we have an element of lack of perfect competition that bankers are able to make special profits over the years. And I associate this power of exclusive rights with privilege. My father taught me something about privilege. Its etymology is that it comes from two Latin words, privus and lex legis. The meanings of those words are private or separate and particular, and law. So a privilege is a private law. A private law is a law that has somebody's name in it. And it lets one person do what other people are not allowed to do, or it could be a law that prevents one person from doing what other people are allowed to do. But that isn't of such interest to us today. A just society, in my opinion, is a society without privilege. My father used to say that there isn't anybody who's underprivileged, because the right amount of privilege for everybody is none. So examples of privilege: water rights, fishing rights, spectrum rights, landing rights, land rights, bank charters, patents, copyrights. I'll let one person do what other people are not allowed to do. What should we do about privilege? If we just let it alone, we have injustice. If we take all of the privilege and put them in the hands of the government, we risk having a domineering government. To some extent, we get value out of having a system of privilege. When we award patents and copyrights, we induce people to write books and come up with new inventions, but we have the inefficiency of monopoly. You wind up charging people for something that doesn't cost anything for one additional unit. You can have a system in which you eliminate the special profit from privilege by saying that whoever gets there first gets the privilege, but that dissipates the value of the privilege in everybody putting their resources in trying to be there first. So whoever gets there first gets it, but the value of somebody getting it is wasted on all the effort that goes into trying to be there first. So that's not the right thing to do either. And if you don't have any rules at all, you'll have a dissipation in another way. If you say that nobody owns the land, then land gets used, it's unproductive to invest in land. The just solution to privilege, I claim, is to assign exclusive rights where that's efficient: land, water rights, fishing rights, spectrum rights, and so on, but to require whoever has the privilege to pay the value of that privilege. So that leads to the idea of a tax on land. Whoever has the title to the land pays the government every year an amount equal to what the rental value of the land would be if it hadn't been improved. This idea of whoever has exclusive right pays the value is closely related to a couple of other ideas from economics. Economists call it internalizing externalities. If you cause harm, you pay the harm you do. We do this, well, economists think we ought to do it more with respect to those who engage in activities that cause pollution. But if you clog up the highways by being on the street when a lot of other people want to be on the street, that causes congestion. And economists were all in favor of the action of the City of London, or not the city within the city, but the mayor of London instituted a charge for driving in London, and the speed with which people could travel around London greatly increased. Once you had to pay, first it was I think £5 and then maybe £10. I can't remember how high it rose, the price for occupying the streets of London. And then it also ought to operate on the other direction, that in most cases those who generate a benefit should be paid for the benefit that they generate, although sometimes a society has to say to people who do really valuable things, thanks a lot, you're a hero, but we can't afford to pay you. That's just the hero's lot, to have to be content with being valued. So concentrating on land first, While most advocates of public collection of the rental land like the idea of the rent going to the public, I'm not quite so happy with that idea. If the rent of land, to the extent that the rent of land comes from nature, we all have equal claims on it. I like the idea of taking the component of the rent of land that's due to nature and using it as the source of a citizen's dividend, something that we all get a share of. If we want to then, by a democratic process, tax ourselves and give some of that back to the government, well, that's okay. But we should understand that to the extent that the rent of land comes from nature, that's something that belongs to all of us equally and should go to each of us in individual shares. To some extent, the rent of land comes from government action. The government pays for streets and sewers and parks and libraries and things like that that add to the value of land. And in my mind, that creates a reason why the government should get a significant share of the rent of land. The component of the rent of land that's due to the provision of infrastructure should go to the local governments, usually local governments, sometimes state governments that generate that. Now, I have another idea. Consider the defense expenditures of Canada and the United States. Canada and the United States are roughly the same size. You might think that they would need roughly the same defense budget, but that doesn't seem to be true. Why would the US think it needs a bigger defense budget than Canada? Well, if you could conquer one country, would you pick Canada or would you pick the United States to conquer? I think you'd pick the United States if you could flip a coin and get whichever one you could get. So the United States needs a bigger defense budget to deter aggression than Canada needs because we're worth more. So what causes us to need a bigger defense budget is all that capital accumulation. So I think that the defense government should be paid for by a wealth tax on capital. So to the extent that people, by accumulating capital, make us more subject to attack, which we can only fend off by having a bigger defense budget, this is internalization of an externality. So that's how I justify.
I like that.
Yeah. Thank you. Well, let me go back to this other one. Rewards for those that generate positive externalities. A lot of the value of land comes from the fact that it's surrounded by private development. And in my ideal system, the component of land that arises from, well, to the extent that private development adds to land value, I would take that land value and give it to those who undertake the private development, because that would motivate them to undertake private development efficiently. And it would, in fact, raise land values even more if we were to do that, because then when you were thinking about developing the land, you would say, boy, if I develop that land, I'll get a rebate for all the increase in value that I generate for other land around it. And so I'd be willing to pay even more rent for that land. So bids up the rents, you collect the rent and take the part of it that is reflected in surrounding land rents and give it to the developers. So the local government gets rent from infrastructure, federal government gets a defense levy, rewards for those who generate positive externalities, the part due to nature. is shared equally, and if you want to be just about it, you would find some way to share it equally on a global level. Now, that might make it sound like I favor a world government. In fact, I don't. I think that a world government would be much too powerful. We're not sufficiently developed as to be prepared to subject ourselves to it. What I have in mind instead is a kind of a world federation, you might say, where individual nations recognize their obligation to inquire into whether they are taking more than their share, and if they are taking more than their share, to pay into a fund that would compensate those who have less than their shares. So that's my ideas with respect to land. Now I'm going to go over to money. The connecting idea, again, is that these are ways of getting rich without doing anything, and so they deserve to be organized in such a way as to prevent that privilege, that special opportunity for some that others are cut out of. Now, I happen to have a different definition of money than Steve. I think that money is different in different societies. I define money to be whatever you make sure you have when you want to go and buy stuff. So I think that among the American Indians, wampum, some kind of worked seashells or something like that was money, and there was never any law that specified that wampum would be money. Money is whatever people gravitate toward as something that they can expect other people to accept in exchange for stuff that they want. So that's my definition of money. Now, while I disagree, or I have a different definition of money than Steve has, there are a lot of things where I agree with Steve. I think that indeed the Fed should be put in the Treasury. We should have a monetary authority that reports to Congress, and we should end fractional reserve banking. Okay. So on the big things, yeah. Well, but it's still interesting to talk about a point of disagreement, and that is on how to put money into circulation. So before I talk about how to put money in circulation, I want to show you some economic data. This is data that anybody can look up. Personal consumption, seasonally adjusted annual rates, monthly in trillions of dollars. What do you see when you look at that graph? A little glitch. When did that glitch occur? Seemed to happen about in the middle of 2008, didn't it? The one that means January of 2008 but about the middle of 2008, suddenly consumption went down. Wasn't that interesting? It went down for about 7-8 months, and then it crept up, but it never got back to its old trend. What was going on in 2008? Well, these gray bars you see represent times of recession, and what I'm plotting there is the ratio of money to disposable personal income, again from public data. And you see it a little bit in the recession of 1990-91, but in the later two recessions you see quite clearly that the ratio of money to disposable personal income rises at a very sharp rate in recessions. Well, so one more graph to show you. Personal savings rate and the unemployment rate. I just collected the data, collected in a slightly different form in which it's usually collected, because one of these appears quarterly and the other appears monthly. So I put them on a average of 3 months. And I didn't calculate what the correlation coefficient is. It might not be 9.97, but I'm pretty confident it's at least 0.9. That's a pretty high correlation rate. So saving goes up at the same time that unemployment goes up. Now, correlation doesn't prove causation, and the causation could go either way. But when I see these statistics put together, they're the story that comes naturally to my mind. In 2008, we had the crisis that started with, well, Bear Stearns to some extent, but then really with, what was the name of that? Lehman Brothers, yes. When Lehman Brothers failed, and the bottom seemed to be dropping out of everything, people got scared. People got scared, and they didn't want to spend money. When you're scared and you think you don't know what's going to happen, you want to have more money in your pocket. And you don't want to spend your money until you feel safe again. But when people aren't spending, other people aren't selling what they wanted to sell, and then they lay off their workers. And you get unemployment. And people get more scared. You get into a terrible, vicious cycle. And that led me to the idea that the way I would like to see money go into circulation is to lend it to people. Now, let's see what I got on the... Okay, in 2008, policy was ineffective. What we did, we brought the interest rate down to zero. Banks could get money for zero interest, but they couldn't find anybody they wanted it to lend it to. The people wanted to have cash in their pockets. And as you heard from other speakers, the only way we can get cash in the economy now is for banks to make loans. And the banks said, who are we going to lend it to? There isn't anybody who's got a worthwhile idea to lend it to. These are bad times. We got to just keep it in our reserves. We should not wait for the banks to loans. And I don't think that we should, I disagree with the idea of giving the money to the government and letting the government put it into circulation. Now, my area of expertise, I said, is not money, it's public finance. And part of my background in public finance leads me to the idea that there is an appropriate level of spending on public finance. It has to do with how much the public wants to spend on the things that we need. And I'm concerned that if we tell the government, here's this $1 trillion or whatever, go spend it on good works, that we won't have good filtering of what's worth spending on and what isn't worth spending on. So that's why I want to take this money that needs to go into the economy and lend it to taxpayers interest-free. So we could create the money by passing it out and say, here's your money to the government, here's your money to the citizens. And I don't want to pass it out. I like the idea of money as debt. Why do I like the idea of money as debt? Well, two reasons. One is, I think that everybody in every generation should have their chance to have their share of money. So I want people to pay back the money before they end their lives. As they get old and stop participating in the economy, it's time to pay back the money that was lent to you, so that when each person turns 18, that person gets their share of the money supply as a lifetime interest-free loan. But if you give all the money away when you first start the system, you won't have any capacity to make a corresponding interest-free loan or a grant to the next generation. In order to provide for intergenerational equity, I think we should lend the money rather than give it. And then there's a possibility that sometime people will feel so safe that they won't want so much money in their pockets. Or perhaps we will have further advances in credit card technology or payment technology that will mean people say, no, I don't need money in my pocket. I can just sell some stock or whatever when I want to buy something. And so I would like to have a money supply that can easily be extinguished. Now, it's true that if you have a government money supply, you can extinguish the money by collecting taxes. But I just don't trust government officials to follow orders when the monetary authority tells them, we need less money, so go out and collect some taxes from individuals and don't have any corresponding spending. To a politician, that sounds like a good recipe for not getting reelected. So it seems to me that it's much more acceptable if we lend money to people interest-free, and then we say to them, look, people don't want to hold as much money in their pockets, so you'll have to pay back now some of that money that we lent to you. I think it could provide for a monetary mechanism that was much more economically stable than the one we have. Now, then the question arises, how should we allocate the money among people? With respect to land, I like the idea of equal amounts of the gifts of nature for people. And there's a sense in which money is somewhat like the gift of nature. It's the opportunity for somebody to have money to spend without having done anything. And we could just divide it up among everybody equally. And for a long time, I liked that idea, and then I decided I didn't like it so well. I like instead the idea of internalizing the externality. If I become very rich and I decide that I really need a bank account at all times of $50,000, that provides the opportunity for there to be $50,000 in the economy without any inflation. So each person, by their demand for cash balances, provides a positive externality of the economy of providing a demand for cash balances that can increase the money supply without inflation. So my subsequent idea with respect to a way to allocate the money among people would be to allocate to each person amount that represented their estimated demand for cash balances as a function of the amount of taxes they pay. So to explore this idea further, I looked up the data on how much money do people have by income, how much taxes do people pay by income. So I have two relationships between income, one for taxes and one for money. And mathematically I estimated them, and from the two estimated relationships I derived another relationship, which I'll now show you. The blue line is the relationship derived from previous estimated relationships. And the red line is a fitted linear equation. So it's roughly $8,000 for those who pay no taxes, and then another, well, let's see, it's about 2.5, or I think it's, yeah, 2.2 times the annual taxes you pay. But annual taxes fluctuate too much. So I was thinking of a relationship like, take the taxes you pay over 5 years, the past 5 years, and give every person 45% of that. 45% of the sum of the taxes you paid over 5 years, plus $8,000. When you turn 18, you get your $8,000 interest-free loan. After that, as you pay taxes, we update your loan every year to be the average of, Yeah, the 45% of the taxes you paid over the last 5 years, in addition to your $8,000 sort of citizen loan. So that's my proposal for how to put money into circulation. Lend it to citizens interest-free according to the combination of an amount determined by the intercept of this estimated relationship that everybody gets, and another amount that represents how much more their estimated demand for cash balances is based on the taxes they pay, the federal income taxes. Well, sort of as an aside now, I want to talk about what I would do about Greece, because that's been talked about. Yeah, okay. So the same, what I would do for Greece, either within the euro or outside of the euro, if I could do it, I would say that what the people of Greece need is interest-free loans. According to how much taxes they pay. The Greeks always have a problem with people cheating on their taxes. So let's reward people who pay their taxes by saying the more that your taxes are, the more taxes you have paid, the bigger the interest-free loan you get. Let's put enough cash into that Greek economy that the people are going to be willing to spend. And so I think that the trouble with the euro is that Europe is larger than an optimal currency area. You can't have a single monetary policy for all of Europe because it's too economically varied. But if you have this policy of putting money into circulation by loans, there's no reason why you can't have a separate currency loan for people in different countries. So that would be my general solution for economic problems in Europe. So now let's talk a bit more about banking. So I said I agree with the idea of no fractional reserves. I think that my reason for no fractional reserves might be a little bit different, or a set of different emphases than the others. And actually there are several reasons. The first is they are dangerous. When we have fractional reserve banking, we have banks lending to speculators, and then we have bubble crashes, and the banks can't continue in existence without bailouts, and we have expensive bailouts, and it just is an unnecessary burden on the taxpayer to bail the banks out when they have to. Now also, in my mind, a reason to not have fractional reserve banking is it's another example of privilege. The banks are always insolvent. Every bank promises to pay on demand to every depositor all the money the depositor has put there. And they can't possibly do it. If any other business had an obligation to make such payments without the corresponding resources to make the payments that it was obliged to make, it would be declared bankrupt and dissolved. But banks are in the special category that they're allowed to operate under these conditions where they can't meet their obligations. And it's not fair for them to have this privilege that others don't have. And then the final thing is that I think that very few people understand the risks that are associated with having the kind of banking system we have. Now, if we had a society that was banking sophisticated and everybody understood what the risks are that are associated with fractional reserve banking and said, yeah, I know all that, but nevertheless, I like that kind of system. They say, okay, you know, I believe in freedom, and including the freedom of societies to have the rules they want. If we have a society where people, while understanding banking, really want it, I'd say, okay, let's have it. But I think we have it because people don't understand it rather than because they understand it and like it. So, I have conception of banking that might be a little bit different from that of the other reformers here. I got my idea of banking, what banks ought to do, from the book Jimmy Stewart is Dead. Jimmy Stewart is Dead by, what's the?
I know his name, but I'm not sure.
Yeah, you invited him here and he wouldn't come.
No, I didn't invite him.
Yeah, Lawrence Kotlikoff, yes. So I don't agree with all of his ideas, but
I like the title of his book.
It's a very strange title for a book on banking. Jimmy Stewart is Dead. Why is that a title for a book on banking? It's because Jimmy Stewart played that character in It's a Wonderful Life. Yeah. Anyway.
Jimmy Stewart was a good banker.
So there are three things that banks ought to do. They ought to store funds in the vault, or it's electronic. You take your money to the bank and they mind it for you. Banks should transfer funds, serve as a payment mechanism for everybody. And banks should sell mutual funds. If you want to invest, you don't deposit your money where you can get it back whenever you want. You buy an investment. You take some risk. And banks are well positioned to help people decide what kind of investments they want to have. As Kotlikoff points out, you could have banks be the agents for lots of different kinds of mutual funds. You could decide you want a credit card fund, a fund that invests in credit card loans or bank loans or house mortgages or business loans, whatever kind of investment you want. You can buy a mutual fund that has that kind of investment to diversify your portfolio in whatever way you want. And interest rates in the market for the different kinds of loans would reflect the requirements of investors, representing the subjective views of investors and what the relative risks were. Now, there's an interaction between land and banking. People have mortgages on their land. If the rent of land is collected by the government, the value of unimproved land falls to zero. People go underwater. Loans become uncollateralized. If people walk away from their loans, banks fail. Now, this means that if we were to try to have land reform without bank reform in the most simplest fashion, we could destroy the economy. And you got to think about that. There are two possible solutions. One solution is to have banking reform first. Get rid of fractional reserve banking. Have a system where banks can't fail. If people walk away from their loans, who's ever invested in those loans is out their money. But the banks are just the intermediaries. They were just the agents for these people. Some people are poor, but the system survives. That's one solution. Solution number two, don't levy a tax on the person who has the deed. Levy the tax on the person who collects the rent. This is an idea that I picked up from Michael Hudson, a difficult but very clever fellow. So under this version, you send a tax bill to whoever has the title to the land, but you say to him, well, if you have a mortgage on the land, to the extent that the person who holds the mortgage expects to collect the rent, the fraction of the rent that he expects to collect, well, tell them you've already paid, the tax was on him, but you've already paid the tax. So you pay your mortgage with your tax receipts. You say, the tax is on the person who's collecting the rent. He was planning to collect the rent. You paid the tax for him. See, here's the tax receipt. You don't owe him any cash. And if that's a bank, the bank says, well, if I don't get the cash, I can't pay the people that I borrowed the money from. So you say to the banker, well, that's all right. They were planning to collect the rent. Pass the tax receipts on to them. Whoever is finally collecting the rent, that is the person who we are levying the tax on. It's an interesting alternative way of looking at a tax on the rental value of land. So now, to recap the principles. Well, you've heard a lot of rather unusual ideas from me. So I want to say that I believe in a separation, a division of labor between theorists and activists. Most of you people are activists, I'm a theorist. Activists are concerned with making things happen. Theorists are concerned with the way ideas fit together. So if you as activists reject all my ideas, I'm not going to complain. My goal is not directly to make things happen. My goal is to put ideas out there for people to think about for how things fit together. And it's for somebody else to decide when these ideas are actionable and when they are only interesting theoretical curiosities. So one principle is the valuable things that no one made are shared. The rent of land, the seigniorage from money, operating through a citizen's dividend. People pay for the costs that they cause. People and governments are rewarded for the benefits they cause. Government keeps the rent generated by infrastructure. People get tax deferral loans for their cash balances. No privilege. Therefore, no private appropriation of rent, no fractional reserve banking. Thank you.
We're in the area that Aristotle refused to tread in.
Oh, by the way, speaking of Aristotle, I learned a nice word from an Aristotle scholar a few weeks ago. The word is pleonexia. Anybody ever hear of pleonexia?
Pleonexia.
No, isn't it pleonexia?
How did you say it?
Pleonexia.
Don't know the meaning of it. Probably heard it.
Pleonexia is the human failing of trying to get more than your share. Yeah.
I think we could have some questions now, or they can be part of the.
Yeah. Well, I think people are.